Welcome to this episode of 10 Minutes with Sam. This is Akshat Singh. Today I'll be speaking with Mr. Neil Datta. Mr. Neil Datta is a member of the investment committee at the Forbes Family Trust, which is an $11 billion family-run hedge fund. He is also the CEO of Meditas Tech, which is an up-and-coming fintech startup. Mr. Datta has been an institutional investor for about 20 years. In his career, he has worked for both the private sector and for the government. We are very, very glad to have you on the show, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and so excited to be here.
So the format of the show is fairly simple. We have 10 minutes and we try covering as much ground as possible in the 10 minutes that we have. So let me begin by asking you, from New Delhi to New York, what are some of the experiences that you've had growing up as a second generation Indian American in the US?
Sure. I think my family story and my story in particular was very typical of a lot of immigrant experiences and growing up in New York and Queens in particular. My parents emigrated from Delhi. They were both city kids in India, got married, came to the US, New York in the early 70s with not much in their pockets and really worked their way and moved to Queens. I grew up in a very diverse community, I think one of the most diverse communities in the world, Queens, New York. And so, maybe the best place to be as an immigrant. I think one thing that was really interesting and maybe kind of common for a lot of immigrants, regardless of what country you come from, is that, especially in my family, big focus on education, big focus on community, big focus on culture, a big focus on being part of our adopted homeland and our new country, but also maintaining the culture identity and the link to the past, and particularly the homeland of my parents.
I mean, that is very interesting. The way you characterize the story curve of your family as being very similar to a lot of Indian immigrants in the US is particularly interesting, primarily because while the success story of Indian Americans in the US is huge, there are also a lot of challenges that the expat communities face in the US. Could you speak a little to that from a personal perspective?
Sure. And it's weird to think about things like racism and being excluded in New York City, the most diverse place in the world. But yeah, I mean, especially in the 70s and 80s, there weren't a lot of places to get, chicken makhni or your naan or, spices. And I remember, my parents would tell me when we were little, they would kind of, have almost like a collective. They would all, somebody would go to India, they'd bring back a bunch of stuff and they'd all kind of share it together. And that's how communities work. And I'm sure, people from China and Korea and a lot of other communities who came en masse to New York and other parts of the world, maintained their culture and their identity through food. And, maybe one of the challenges was just not getting all the things you need. I know, especially in the beginning, one vivid memory I had as a kid was my parents having to call home back to India, and it being really expensive to call from home. So we'd have to go to the payphone with stacks of quarters, and this is things you remember as a child before cell phones and before email and things like that.
I'm sure, given the fact that you grew up in New York and you grew up in Queens specifically, and the Indian enclave in Queens is very predominant. I'm sure that things were not as dire there as in several parts of the country.
Sure. But believe it or not, there was still racism. There was some, I remember, because even parts today that if you look at parts of Queens and parts of New York that, are very, very diverse, even in the 80s, they weren't that diverse. So there were pockets of New York that were still predominantly, white or predominantly other ethnicities. So just being, the oddball and one of the few early Indian immigrants, because I think the story of Indians in the US, most of the people that are around my age weren't born in the US. They typically immigrated in the 80s and 90s. So I think there's this kind of huge community of folks who came, later on, but their demographics shifted. So I think there was a lot of pushback from the community, and there was maybe not the welcoming nature that you'd expect in big city.
That is absolutely true. You mentioned that a lot of immigration to the US happened in the 80s and 90s. And I characterize that area as the pre-internet boom. A lot of times that we see Indians coming to the US, they are in, tech-related jobs and so on.
Right.
My question to you then is, how did you exactly end up in finance? When we think about the Indian community, we think about doctors, we think about engineers.
Right.
Think about high finance much. How do you end up there?
Yeah, I just like everyone else. I was pre-med. I wanted to be in medical school. I was an EMT. I was working in a hospital. I was on an ambulance, and working in a hospital, I realized I didn't want to be a doctor. But fortunately or unfortunately, I like money, so I went into finance. It seemed like the next best option, and I've never looked back.
I'm glad it worked out for you. This is a very classic example of, selection by exclusion.
Sure.
I did not want to be a doctor, and that's why I chose to become
sure.
an investment banker. Yeah. So Neil, one of the most significant developments for the Indian American community that had happened in the past couple of years is the election of Kamala Harris. How do you think the election will shape the Indian community in the United States now?
I think it's fantastic for the Indian community, having the first person of color, the first woman in the vice president's chair, a heartbeat away from the presidency, and having her being of South Asian descent is a huge sense of pride for my family and every person I know, particularly folks like myself who are of Indian origin but don't live in India, and I think it just bodes well. And it speaks to the type of value our community adds outside of India, in the corporate world, in Wall Street, and medicine, and finance, and now in politics. And I think if you start looking at cabinet positions, if you start looking at the circuit courts and eventually Supreme Court, you'll start seeing more and more penetration of the Indian diaspora in those positions that have historically been closed off.
While we speak today, India is suffering from one of the worst scenarios that COVID-19 has created in any other countries around the world. So first, let's talk about the economy, since you have been in investment for a very long time. How do you think COVID-19 will have an effect on the investment climate in India?
It's heartbreaking what's going on in India right now. And really, outside of the last 6 weeks or so, India was really a success story in terms of being a net exporter of vaccines and having a pretty low positivity rate. That changed very quickly, and I think it's still yet to be seen how it happened. But I think from a financial and economic perspective, at least speaking for us and people that I speak to, we were very bullish in India. One tidbit from the institutional investor standpoint is that the folks that I speak to have historically had a lot of exposure to places like China, Brazil, Russia, but historically have had very little in India. And I think that is changing to a certain extent for a lot of reasons, but primarily is that a lot of institutional investors have lost confidence in the metrics, the monetary policy, the political climate, and India is seen to a very certain extent as a safe haven from all that nonsense. And I think you'll continue to see positive capital flows from both institutions and retail investors.
Let's hope for the best. The situation looks slightly dire, very dire right now.
Yeah.
Let's hope that as it unfolds, that the post-COVID scenario means better economic growth, at least. Neil, that brings us to the end of 10 minutes. Thank you so much for being on the show today. We would love to speak with you sometime soon again.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.